This is the Brighton axe murderer. Cathy Krauseneck was thought to be killed by her husband, then a man that lived in the neighborhood. Within 44 hours of her death, the husband was a suspect. Cathy Krauseneck was thought to be killed by her husband, then a man that lived in the neighborhood. Within 44 hours of her death, the husband was a suspect. There wasn't enough evidence to convict him. The case sat cold for 40 years. But did her husband put an axe in her head as she slept in their bed? In Rochester, New York, retired detective Marc Liberatore helps with one of the coldest cases in America. On February 19, 1982, police responded to a house where upon walking in, they encountered a horrific scene. The body of a 29-year-old mother, Cathy Krauseneck, was dead with an axe lodged in her head. She was found laying on her side, indicating that Cathy was asleep the entire time. The single blow killed her instantly. James told police he arrived home from work to find Cathy dead. The couple's 3.5-year-old daughter, Sarah, crying, had been alone in the house with the body all day. James was interviewed by first responders. He told them that he had grabbed his daughter to call 911 from a neighbor. He was emotional and crying. He continued by saying that he had left for work at the usual time of 6:30 a.m. and was gone all day. The police talked to Sarah also that night, telling them that there was a bad man asleep in mommy and daddy's bed with an axe in his head. When they asked if the man was black or white, Sarah told them that the man was multicolored. Hearing this, the investigators believed that Sarah had not seen a man at all, but her mother covered in blood. When the crime scene was processed by police, they found no significant clues, and in 1982, DNA was not yet used as an investigative tool. To police, the scene looked as though a robbery had just left half finished. A door to the outside had a pan broken and a heavy axe leaned against the wall. This axe and the one in Cathy's head belonged to the family. The dining room had expensive items laying around. Her purse was just lying on the floor, its contents strewn about. A silver tea set just sitting on the floor almost undisturbed. A black trash bag was found with a shoe print on it as if someone stepped on it to hold it open. The scene was staged to distract from the murder. It was then when the police started to focus on James Krauseneck. Could James have killed his wife and left her daughter with the body alone all day? Cathy and James had grown up in the same small town in Michigan. They met in high school, then dated in college, getting married after graduation. They had a fancy wedding and Sarah was born in 1978. Friends say that Cathy's behavior changed about 6 months before she died. Police found a pamphlet about marriage counseling. If the Krausenecks were having problems, no one in their lives knew about it. It came out during the original investigation that James had gotten his job at Kodak on false pretenses. He had never finished the PhD that was needed for the job. James was originally helpful with police, but he disappeared before his third interview on the afternoon of the next day. The investigators tracked James and Sarah down in Michigan. Bringing James and Sarah back, investigators continued to question him. 10 days after the murder of his wife, James hired an attorney. This is always a good idea, no matter if you are innocent or guilty. An autopsy was done, and the medical examiner determined that the time of the death was within the hours of 4:30 to 7:30 a.m. This information was helpful, but they still had no clear motive, and at that time, they didn't feel confident going to trial. James and Sarah eventually moved west, getting away from the murder scene. Sharon, James's third wife, met James at a trade show in '97, and sparks flew. Sharon and James lived in Seattle and dated for 2 years after they met. James and Sarah had moved there about 10 years ago in '87. Sharon had been told about Cathy's murder, though James had left out the details. She never pressed for more information because her husband got so upset about it. Sharon and James married in '99. District Attorney Sandra Dorley was also looking into Cathy's murder around this time. In 2015, the FBI provided resources to the Brighton Police Department. Marc Liberatore thought that the evidence all pointed to James Krauseneck. So on April 16, 2016, investigators went to talk to James and Sharon. They talked for over an hour. During this time, the police started to accuse James of Cathy's murder. This was the first time that Sharon had heard about the details of the murder. She had no idea that James had ever been a suspect and never thought that her husband of about 23 years could ever have done it. Detectives were hoping to find evidence that tied James to the murder this time. In 2016, DNA could be tested and could shed light on a suspect. Over time, DNA can degrade, but when the FBI tested it, they could not match the DNA. James had always claimed that Cathy was alive when he left the house at 6:30. So they needed to find a time of death, not just a window, to prove that he had been home at the time of the murder. In 2018, prosecutors turned to Dr. Michael Badson. He has investigated deaths from JFK to Nicole Brown Simpson to Jeffrey Epstein. Dr. Badin reviewed evidence and analyzed data stating that the time of death for Cathy was 3:30 a.m. to the window of time arrived at in 1982. With this new information, prosecutors went in front of a grand jury. The grand jury indicted James Krauseneck on November 1st, 2019. James surrendered himself a week later. The defense claimed that James was not the killer. The killer was Ed Larrabee. Ed had a reputation in prison as a violent sexual predator and a psychopath. Before he died behind bars in 2014, Larrabee served 32 years for charges that included attempted murder, robbery, and his specialty, rape. All too often, Ed had been released, and every time he was released, he would continue to rape. He liked laughing at the women he attacked. Rachel Rear, who wrote the book Catching the Sparrow, about a story close to home. It is about the disappearance of her stepsister, Stephanie Kupczynski, in '91. 27-year-old Kupczynski was a music teacher and a violinist when her life intersected with Ed Larrabee. In '91, Larrabee was freshly paroled after serving time for robbery. He returned to the suburbs of Rochester that was his familiar hunting ground. He got a job at the Newcastle apartments where Stephanie had lived. Larrabee himself had said that they were foolish to hire him. Not long after he was hired and started working, Stephanie disappeared without a trace. It was almost as though she had evaporated into thin air. There were no clues as to what happened. After she disappeared, the tenants in the community at large were rattled. 7 years later, Stephanie's body was discovered in a bag placed in a shallow grave. It was determined that she had been strangled. More than 12 years later, Larrabee at this point was again in prison, having been convicted of her other crimes. He admitted that Stephanie was indeed one of his victims. In 2012, Larrabee was dying from ALS, a neurodegenerative disease of nerves in the brain and spine. The disease is also more commonly referred to as Lou Gehrig's disease. He was trading confessions for requesting making his limited time better. Some of these requests included sandwiches and to be buried on prison grounds. In his confession, Larrabee included some details. He said that he entered her apartment upon seeing him. She screamed, causing him to choke her to death. Once he started confessing to other murders. One of these was a murder of a 29-year-old housewife and mother in February 1982. It was Cathy Krauseneck. At the time, Larrabee was out of prison and living 5 minutes away from the Krausenecks. It was a shock to no one that Larrabee may have killed Cathy. In '82, the police went to see Larrabee, though on the day that they went, he was not willing to talk. So the officers went back and filed the report. They never bothered to talk to him again. Did investigators drop the ball by only visiting him once and ignoring him in '82? It was a major lapse in judgment during the investigation. This caused the officers that filled the report to be let go afterwards. FBI and investigators, though, don't believe that Ed Larrabee killed Cathy. He was a bad guy, but he didn't do it. His written confession didn't match the fact in the case. Some mistakes within the confession: she had dark hair, but she had blonde hair. She was heavyset, but she was not. After 3 decades of dead ends, investigators were convinced that James Krauseneck was the one wielding the axe. October of 2022, James headed to trial for the murder of his first wife, Cathy. Now the 40-year-old case hinged on getting a firm time of death for Cathy. The evidence all points to her being killed in her sleep. Prosecutors, after 40 years, they were counting on Dr. Badin, a forensic pathologist. They retained to testify, and his theory that she had been killed at 3:30 a.m. This was different than any other medical examiner. Dr. Cathy Maloney, the forensic pathologist retained by the defense, she has not been able to pinpoint Cathy's time of death. She only came up with a window of time. She even thinks that Cathy could have been killed later in the day. The window of time that Dr. Maloney came up with was 5 a.m. to 1 p.m. Cathy's 95-year-old father today believes that his son-in-law killed his daughter, even though for years he thought that James was innocent. Investigators believe that the marriage was secretly crumbling. He just snapped. James Krauseneck doesn't look like an axe murderer, but what does an axe murderer look like? Ted Bundy didn't look like a serial killer, but he was. James over time started to separate Sarah from her mother's family. Sarah, grown now, is positive her father is innocent. Prosecutors have another challenge ahead of them in the trial: time. After 40 years, it would be hard for any witnesses to remember to recall what they saw or heard. Since this was the case, investigators focused on the crime scene. The house was ransacked, cash was left on the bedroom dresser, the silver tea set just placed on the floor. The shoe print on the trash bag was thought to be an important clue. The only way that investigators believed that the shoe print got on the bag was by stepping on it, making the opening bigger. Investigators believe that the print came from a special type of footwear, a boat shoe. Why, there was a picture of boat shoes in the bedroom at the time of the murder, but the shoes were never tested to see if they were a match. The defense continues to blame Ed Larrabee. His MO was that of a sexual predator, and there was no sign of sexual assault in the case. The defense even thinks that the investigators had the textbook definition of tunnel vision when it comes to finding a suspect in the case. They just wanted to close the case. For closing statements, the press was allowed in the courtroom. The defense says in 1982 there were no eyewitnesses or ear witnesses, and it is the same today. While the prosecutor says only be the husband, the scene was staged. No one else was placed in the house. Now his fate is in the opinions of the 12 jurors. It took them less than 10 hours to find James guilty of second-degree murder. The jury was 6 guilty, 3 not guilty, 3 undecided when they started their deliberation. They thought that the staged scene and the time of death were important evidence in their decision to convict. At 75, James is sentenced to 25 years to life. At this stage of life, this sentence means that James Krauseneck will never get out. Cathy's father wants to move his daughter's body from James' family plot before he dies. This, though, may never happen as he needs Sarah to agree. Sarah stands behind her father during this appeals process. They stated that trying him for a 40-year-old murder violates his constitutional right to a fair trial. Justice for Cathy seems to have been done no matter what comes of the appeals process. This case has a book written about it by Elizabeth Brundage. There's a link in the description, which has been adapted into a movie called Things Heard and Seen on Netflix. This has been the Brighton Axe Murder, and you're listening to Grimworld. Don't forget to subscribe. Do you think James Krauseneck did it? I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, because I really don't know myself.